Good afternoon and welcome to CRC's webinar series, Cooling the Capital Region, From Models to Implementation. This webinar, Strategies for Safeguarding the Transportation System, is the second in our series. This webinar is organized by the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative, or CRC, in partnership with the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. My name is Grace Kaufman. I'm a project manager at the Local Government Commission, and I serve as staff for CRC, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. A quick overview of today's agenda. I will first provide a brief intro to CRC for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Then Dr. Haider Taha from Alto Stratus will provide an overview of modeled scenarios on albedo improvements, focus areas for pavement increases, and EV scenarios. After, Climate Resolve's Executive Director, Jonathan Parfrey, will discuss the successes and challenges of LA's urban heat island. After, Kerry Whitlock from the City of Elk Grove will discuss Elk Grove transportation sector vulnerability assessment and other strategies the city is looking at to mitigate the heat island. And now, before I get started, I have a few logistical items to go over. Everyone will be muted except for our panelists. Due to the large number of participants, we ask that you type your question into the question box. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. I will summarize those questions during the Q&A portion, which will follow Kerry's presentation. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll ask our presenters to respond after the webinar, and we will share the responses in a follow-up email. This webinar will also be recorded and made available on CRC's website along with the PowerPoint presentations. So as I mentioned, this webinar is being organized by the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. CRC is a collaborative of local leaders seeking to build resilience through California's capital region. We bring together stakeholders from across sectors and jurisdictions to find regional solutions to address our shared challenges: drought, extreme heat, flooding, wildfires, and more. Our goal is to help the 6 counties of El Dorado, Placer, Sacramento, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba, and the communities they encompass, thrive in the face of a changing climate. The Local Government Commission serves as the program administrator for CRC. If you have any questions or if you are interested in joining CRC, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Now on to our featured presentations. Dr. Haider Taha is the president and scientist of Alto Stratus Incorporated. Previously, he was a staff scientist with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, or LBNL, for 12 years, during part of which he was a deputy leader of LBNL's Heat Island Group. From 2004 to 2011, he was adjunct professor of meteorology at San Jose State University. He has published over 200 scientific papers, reports, and book sections on these topics. Dr. Taha is a member of the American Meteorological Society Board on the Urban Environment, and in 2010 received the AMS Editors Award for the Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology. Jonathan Parfrey is the Executive Director at Climate Resolve. Before founding Climate Resolve, Jonathan served as a commissioner at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power from 2008 to 2013. He is currently a fellow at the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities and a member of the State of California Climate Adaptation Technical Advisory Committee. In April 2016, he received the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors Chair Green Leadership Award, but most importantly, he has helped start LARC, the Los Angeles Area Climate Collaborative, and along with Bruce Reardon, Kate Meese, and Michael McCormick, Jonathan helped establish the statewide Alliance of Regional Climate Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, or ARCA. Next up is Kerry Whitlock. Kerry Whitlock is the Strategic Planning and Innovation Program Manager for the City of Elk Grove and an AICP candidate. She has over 20 years of experience in working on project management, community engagement, organizational coordination and collaboration, and health. Kerry spent 20 years working at the federal level with the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development. She recently joined the City of Elk Grove and focuses on issues related to sustainability, climate change, innovation, and the census. With a master's degree in both demography and urban and regional planning, she understands the need to put people at the center of planning and using data for decision-making. And now, quick reminder to all participants to please type your questions into the control panel at any point during the webinar. And Haider, you are up.
Oh, okay. So I have control. Let's see. Somehow the screen is now moving.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Grace. Appreciate it. And hello, everybody. And so, sort of picking up from where we left off in last week's webinar, today we'll talk a little bit about urban heat and urban heat mitigation, and focusing a little bit more on the aspects that relate to the transportation system. So to start things off, I'm showing this map, which corresponds to the 6 counties capital region, and it also corresponds to the 2-kilometer resolution modeling domain that we use in this study. And you can see the major transportation corridors in the area, as well as, if you happen to see my cursor, as well as these relatively more local networks of roadways in blue. And so the regional effects, the main transportation routes, are evaluated at 2-kilometer resolution. The local roadways in the blue are evaluated at community scale or 500-meter resolution in the model. I guess I lost control. Next slide. Oh, okay. And so the simulations in this study were done using the WRF-ARW modeling system. And in particular, the urban modules or urban model or parameterizations of WRF were applied in this study. And these are modifications to the model that allow it to better simulate the impacts of urban environment and mitigation measures and impact on the microclimate and thermal environment in the area. And so what I'm showing here is an example of some of the modifications that are continuously being done at AutoStratus to improve the model's input data, bottom-up approach in characterizing the surface, certain aspects of the model representations for urban areas as well as urban parameterizations. And the goal of all of that is to improve the model's ability to simulate the effects of certain urban features, including, in this case, roadways and pavements. You're looking at this red rectangle, which is one of 6 500-meter resolution domains in the capital region. And what I'm showing on the upper right part is basically a temperature difference between a scenario produced by the, let's call it the AutoStratus modified urban WRF versus the standard urban WRF. So this is a difference in surface temperature between the two models. So you can see that the modifications and improvements in the model, in the urban module, makes it able to detect and see certain features. In this case, you can see all the roadways that I'm labeling, some of which are labeled. What I'm trying to say is that the modifications allow the model to see these features and account for their effects. And the standard version of the model does not actually see this, the model out of the box. And so this is quite important for our application because we're looking at urban heat island, urban effects, and in this case, we're looking at roadways and transportation system. This slide I'll talk about later if you have time or if you have questions. But I wanted to say that the impacts of urban heat at the regional scale, local scale, and the transportation system were evaluated in this study in like 2 tiers. One of them is the regional scale, which is what you're looking at, trying to characterize urban heat, its distribution in space and time, and how that relates to certain Caltrans facilities or projects. And so, as I mentioned in the last webinar, this project produced a large number of periods, and each was characterized with its own UHII from 2013 to 2016. We also developed Urban Heat Island Index for year 2050, again, for a number of periods, both for RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. What I'm showing in this slide is a generic, it means a sample from the Urban Heat Island Index that was produced in this study. And the main purpose is to show that once you overlay 2 types of information, in this case, Urban Heat Island Index, and the facilities such as airports, Amtrak stations, state highways, even traffic density or traffic volume, it kind of gives you an initial impression, initial idea of where the facilities are relative to, let's say, the highest score or the worst urban heat conditions. Where would you like perhaps to start with or prioritize resources? So this is some sort of an information as an initial guide. similarly, it's also important to see how the impacts of mitigation measure affect the urban environment throughout the 6 counties region. In other words, in this case, we're looking at the impact on cooling. And the reason is because you want to see where cooling is most effective, where the temperature is most responsive to certain surface modifications, and so on. So this is just a random example at 1 p.m. in July 28, 2015, and for 3 different scenarios involving increase in albedo, namely reflective pavements and ropes. So on the upper left, which is a scenario of small increases in albedo, and that's impervious albedo, both ropes and pavements. And so you can see it produces at most a cooling of 1.5 degrees at that hour. That's 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you can see the outlines of almost all of the urban areas showing up, although that outline increases and becomes clearer as the mitigation measures increase. On the upper right side, you see the effect of a larger increase in albedo. And by the way, these scenarios are defined in the table on the lower right side. And in this case, the maximum cooling is about 2.4 degrees Celsius at certain spots. It's not throughout, but that's the largest cooling at a few spots, especially in areas that are densely built up. Finally, on the bottom left, this is a scenario where we combine increased albedo and vegetation cover, which is one of the most effective scenarios. And at a few spots, the cooling actually reaches almost 4 degrees Celsius. And so the idea, and all of these details are provided in a technical report that will be coming out soon. The idea is to be able to characterize the region in terms of the heat, in terms of mitigation potential, and ranking the measures at that scale. So you get an idea of what can be best done and where and what conditions, what time of day, what period, and so on. So having had this first impression about the regional impacts of urban heat on the transportation system and vice versa in terms of cooling, we now look at the Finescale modeling at community level. And again, I'm using the same example that we saw earlier for the same domain, which is D07, including central Sacramento, southeast, and northwest or northeast Sacramento. And so what I want to show, by the way, these little dots that you see in the figure, these are the grid cells, and the distance between any 2 dots is 500 meters, and that's the reason why I call it 500-meter domain. And so the point I want to make is that in each of the 6 different 500-meter domain in the capital region, a number of different scenarios are modeled, and these are based on feedback received from the district, the QMD, LGC, the project technical advisory committee, the cities, and the communities in there. In this particular domain, we're looking at 3 different areas or locations of interest. The orange one or yellow-orange one, these are the AB 617 communities that were defined by the Sacramento Metro AQMD. The dark or bold lines show you the main routes, the main freeways and highways in the region. They're also highlighted with white lettering. These are of interest in testing and evaluating the effects of vehicle electrification or EV ownership. And finally, the red lines are MTP projects going on or planned in the area, and these were defined per WSP as points of interest in this domain. So the idea is to see how cool pavements and sometimes cool roofs in this particular case, how they affect the environment and the temperature in these 3 areas or contexts of interest. So here's an example, again, random hour at 3 p.m. average over August 1st to 15 of 2016, which is an average summer weather condition. And you can see the big blobs, let's call them, these are the AB 617 communities, and those thin strips correspond to the MTP project that we showed earlier. So the scenario you're looking at is that on the MTP roadway, the albedo is increased, but is capped at 0.35. In other words, it cannot exceed 0.35. For the disadvantaged communities, the albedo on roads is increased, but cannot exceed 0.5, and the pavements in those areas cannot exceed 0.3. The reason for capping the increase in albedo to this level is twofold. One, because these are reasonable levels. We are not, as I like to say, we're not looking at Casablanca or anything like that. It's not an extreme scenario. It's something very reasonable that's doable with materials and practices that are already out there in the market, and it's quite common to see them in the field. And the second thing is to prevent or avoid any potential negative effects, for example, glare, or potential thermal or negative thermal impacts on pedestrians and so on. So that's the reason why these levels are kept reasonable. And so with that in mind, what kind of effects we're looking at in terms of pavement surface temperature change, and that's the actual surface temperature of the pavement, the range of cooling is all the way to something like 13 degrees Celsius. That's about maybe 23 or 24 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, it doesn't happen everywhere. This is just the maximum. And you can see the dark spot is where this is actually occurring. In terms of urban canopy temperature change, this is a little tricky because this is actually a combination of surface and air temperature. The cooling reaches all the way to 5 degrees Celsius, which is 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So just to give you an idea of how we're doing the analysis at community level, looking at these measures and what kind of impact it has on surface and air temperature. The other thing that was looked at in this study is the impact of fleet electrification or EV ownership in the area, and it was done at two levels. One is area-wide, as you can see in this slide, and the other was to evaluate the effects along the major transportation highways and freeways. So here, we're looking at the potential impacts of electrification per the district ZEV readiness plan. And so what you're looking at on the left side, this is domain 07 that I presented earlier, including the main area in Sacramento. And the one next to it, or on top of it, is the area of Rocklin and Roseville. In both cases, and I'm just putting them next to each other just to save space, you see these black triangle. These are the hydrogen or charging stations per the district's plan. And so the assumption is made to evaluate this scenario is that there is 25% electrification, meaning 25% EV ownership at those locations, at those triangles, at those charging stations, if you wish, and that electrification level decreases radially outwards from these stations. So if you look at these little dots, these are the model grid cells. So you can see they go from black around each triangle to dark brown, brown, orange, yellow, and finally white, meaning there's a decrease in electrification as you go outward until it reaches zero at the radius of influence, which is 10 kilometers in this case. There are many different ways you can do that. This is just one scenario. And so on the right side is the corresponding surface temperature change that you get from this kind of mitigation or 25% maximum electrification. So we're looking at, again, a random period, which is 5 p.m. in the afternoon, that's rush hour, average over August 1 to 15 of 2016. On the top right, this is the Rocklin-Roseville area. It can be cooled, the surface can be cooled by up to 1.8 degrees Celsius in a particular spot near Roseville, as you can see, if you can see my cursor moving. And on the lower left part, this is the big Sacramento area. It can be cooled by up to 3.3 degrees C, and this is concentrated right over downtown and southwest of it. In general, most of the area sees a reduction of about 0.5 to roughly 1.2 degrees C, but these are the maxima. The other way to evaluate the impacts of electrification is to assume 25% EV ownership along the main freeways and highways in the area. So here we're looking at I-80, I-5, Highway 99, and 50. In the top is the impact on the actual roadway surface temperature, again at rush hour, but a different period in 2013. And you can see that the maximum cooling is 2.4 degrees Celsius, and that occurs again in areas close to downtown. It's not all over. It's just the maximum cooling. In terms of air temperature at 2 meters above these freeways and highways, the maximum change would be about 1.5 degrees C. And again, you can see where that happens. The darker spot is where this maximum is occurring. And so you can think of this as a bonus or additional benefit, let's say, for Caltrans that they can add to the effects of cool pavement. Let's see. So now we're going to go really quick. The next 3 slides show some sort of an overall picture of the impacts of these cool pavements and electrification at certain MTP project locations, as well as through areas with major freeways and highways. The reason why these look a little strange is because it's not a continuous temperature change field. It's temperature change right at the location, at the streets or areas of interest. So that's the reason why it looks kind of sparse throughout the general domain. Anyway, going quickly through this, the top 2 figures show the area of Yuba City, Marysville. On the left side is the effect of cool pavement. On the right side is electrification, and you can see the hours, the time of day. On the left side, you get a maximum cooling of 11 degrees Celsius in those dark blue areas. On the right side, electrification produces a cooling of 1.8. Similar information on the bottom for woodland. On the left side is cool pavement, and it produces cooling up to 10.9 degrees C at the given hour. On the right side is surface temperature change from electrification, goes to all the way to 2.2 degrees C cooling. Now we're looking at domain 7 again for Sacramento, which I just presented. On the right side is the effect of electrification. You get all the way to 2.4 degrees Celsius. On the bottom is looking at Sacramento, Roseville, and Granite Bay area. Again, on the left side, it's cool pavement, all the way to 13.7 degrees C. On the right side is electrification. Again, it goes to 2.3 degrees C. It's just to throwing around some orders of magnitude so you can get a sense of potentially what kind of effects we get. Finally, here we're looking at Folsom, El Dorado Hills. On the top left is 12.6 degrees C from cool pavement. On the right side is 1.8 C from electrification. On the bottom, same type of information, but for Placerville, Diamond Springs. And so you could see up to 10 to 12, 13 degrees C cooling in terms of cool pavements throughout the regions, and maybe 1.5 to 2.2 degrees C in terms of electrification, again, throughout the region. And finally, one more slide. And this is a sample of many tabulations that will be provided in the technical report. And this is showing you on top of the information that we presented earlier and that I just talked about today, is the ranking of different measures. So this is basically a listing of areas and projects in the first column, and the second column is their all-hour urban heat island index. Here it happens to be in degrees Fahrenheit. Then the middle column is a listing of measures in standalone. In other words, each measure by itself produces the next cooling, provided on the right side. No combinations are presented here. And there are 2 columns on the right side. The one on the left is how much cooling or how much of the UHII can each of these measures offset if a community did implement these measures by itself, meaning if nobody else in the capital region did anything. On the right side is a combined effect if a community did implement this measure and the neighboring community, let's say 2 to 4 kilometer upwind, also implemented cool or urban heat mitigation measures. So you can see the effect almost doubling in all of the scenarios. And you can also compare the relative effects of, let's say, cool pavements versus cool pavements in roads or electric vehicles either standalone or in combination. So just to give you a sense of the mitigation potential, some measures can offset the UHII completely, for example, over 100%. Some will require combinations. But then again, all this information is available in the report, and you can see which one is most effective for your particular location. I think the last slide is simply a sample of pavement material based on work by Levinson and Gilbert et al. And this is something that might come up in some questions later on. So with that, I will yield back to you, Grace. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Dr. Taha. Jonathan, are you ready?
I am.
All righty.
Thanks for the introduction. Again, I'm Jonathan Parfrey with the organization Climate Resolve, coming to you live from downtown LA. By the way, I just want to say that Dr. Taha is one of the world's experts in the area of urban cooling, and the degree of science that you guys have just heard is just among the world's best. And just the analysis on how you get greater cooling when it's done in combination with communities that are upwind. I think Hyder actually wrote the book on that analysis. I don't know of other people doing that kind of work. And also on electric vehicle cooling for a region. This is really groundbreaking, great stuff. So you're all very lucky to have him on board. All right. So yeah, that's kind of the way our sky looks today, unfortunately. So we do have a lot of aerosols here, and we could go to the next slide. The purpose of this presentation is to kind of provide a background on some of the work our organization has been doing, as well as the work that we've inspired at the city and county levels as well. Next slide, please. So this is some work that's been done by Glenn Hulley at the Jet Propulsion Lab here in Los Angeles in the Pasadena area. And I just wanted to share with you the analysis that's been done on just urban warming over the last 100 years. And as you can see, there is definitely a direction of warming, mainly through the urban heat island effect. We have a lot of these thermal masses here in Los Angeles are highways, and I want to direct your attention to the cell on the right. That photograph was taken by a satellite at what would be 4 in the morning on a summer's day. So you have all that thermal heat from the previous day that is now warming in our communities through the rest of even into the evening. And I think when it comes to public health, the concept that we have these large thermal masses emitting throughout the night, keeping Los Angeles much warmer than it should be, is a very important fact. And most public health experts are very clear on the subject that people need cool nights in order for their bodies to recover and to become healthy and better prepared for the next day's warming. But if it's hot through the night, that's when you see real injury and death. Next slide, please. And now, that was just urban heat island. Now I want to introduce climate impacts. And we're also blessed here in Southern California that we have some excellent researchers at UCLA that have done a number of dynamical and in combination with statistical downscales of global climate models, taking into account the unique topography of Los Angeles. In LA, we have beaches, we have ocean, we have foothills, we have basins, we have valleys, we have mountains, we have desert. And when you have that kind of really distinct and diverse topographical areas, you get a very big swing in temperature. And so I just wanted to share this chart with you. Some of you have been to Los Angeles. So look on there and you can see Venice, California in our baseline of 1980 to 2000. You see that they rarely get a day above 95 degrees. And then even going out into the mid-century in the 2040 to 2060 epoch, you'll see that it also doesn't get that much warmer. But if you go just as the crow flies from Venice over the Santa Monica Mountains, you'll come to Woodland Hills. And that might only be, I don't know, like 6 miles as the crow flies. And yet, in those 6 miles, you can see in the baseline of 36 days currently above, or in the baseline of 1980 to 2000, 36 days above 95 degrees. But Dr. Alex Hall at UCLA has projected that that community will see around 70 days above, above 95 degrees. And also in the San Fernando Valley, you have the community of Porter Ranch, which is just, again, maybe only about 5 miles from Woodland Hills. And yet, in those 5 miles, you can see that there's also significant warming. And this is all just within the city of Los Angeles. So I just wanted to impress upon you, I'm not talking about urban heat island. I'm talking very specifically about, this is now climate predictions for the coming decades. Next slide, please. So, next slide. Here comes the more hopeful news. And oh, that's too bad. I thought I had a graphic, and there it is. Yay, yay graphic. All right, so our organization took Dr. Hall's data very seriously, and we thought, what could we do at Climate Resolve to address the problem of climate change and the problem of the urban heat island effect? And we thought that all of our research pointed in the direction that people need a sense that there's something they can do about climate change, or else they'll just throw up their hands and walk away. And by giving people the ability to cool down their communities is empowering and would give them hope that then there are other steps that we can take on a more global level, a more national level, after we've been able to address things locally. And so beginning in 2012, going into 2013, and then finally signed by the mayor in 2014, we introduced a new cool roof policy for the city of LA. And in essence, if you look at the bottom of the table under minimum 3-year age solar reflectance, the important number is the 0.2, because that is for steep slope roofs. That's the traditional single family household. And that means that 20% of that roof will reflect the sun's energy away from the actual home. And so what we've been able to push through is a mandate that every new or refurbished roof in the city of LA has to be a cool roof of at least a solar reflectance of 0.2. Next slide, please. And the Mayor Garcetti embraced our efforts to address urban heat island. And so it became part of the city of LA's policy that there would be a target to reduce the temperature in Los Angeles by 0.7 degrees by the year 2025, 5 years from now, below the baseline of the year 2010, and to reduce the urban heat island by 3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2035. Next slide, please. And this policy of curbing the urban heat island has now been placed into it's been developed further in the resilience plan for the city of LA that was released a couple of years ago. And our organization has worked closely with tree people and UCLA's School of Public Health to come out with some research that is very similar to what you just heard from Dr. Taha on analyzing neighborhood by neighborhood, and would we be able to reduce mortality, the actual deaths from heat exposure in Los Angeles? And the answer, I'll cut to the chase, is that the more mitigation that you do, as Dr. Taha pointed out, greater the benefits. And in fact, if we are able to maximally do the highest form of mitigation, which is a combination of high albedo materials, such as cool roofs and cool streets and cool walls and cool parking lots and cool playgrounds, if we're able to do that in combination with an enhanced tree canopy in Los Angeles, we could in essence delay the climate change induced warming in Los Angeles by 25 to 60 years. And I think that's a very big finding. And that's part of the research of the LA Urban Cooling Collaborative that Tree People led and that we were part of. Next slide, please. And again, last year, Mayor Garcetti went beyond his previous sustainability plan and what he's calling the Green New Deal for Los Angeles. And again, our targets on urban cooling were again emphasized by the mayor. Next slide. And just last week, the mayor again updated his Green New Deal. And I'm not in this photograph, but we were there at the ceremony in downtown LA in the end of January. It was kind of warm. Or was it February? Anyway, it was very recent. And again, the mayor pointed out the various policies that he wanted to push for on cool roofs and enhanced tree canopy in the city. Next slide, please. Now, not to be outdone by the city, our friends at LA County have created a really amazing sustainability plan. It's called Our County. If you want to see a sustainability plan that's done very, very well, I highly recommend it. Los Angeles County, by population, is the largest county in the United States, and I thought they finally stepped up and did some smart work here. And again, I want to point out that the steep slope roofs in Los Angeles County, they decided to outdo Los Angeles City by increasing the solar reflectance to a 0.25 solar reflectance value. And so now the LA City in Mayor Garcetti's last plan is matching what LA County did. So all new and refurbished roofs have to have shingles of 0.25 or higher. And I should also mention that LA County is soon coming out with the climate change vulnerability study. That RFP actually closes today. So Hyder, if you weren't on a team, I'm sorry, but I think that's it. They've closed that today. Next slide. I have some good news. So that City of LA policy signed by the mayor in 2014 has resulted in a minimum of 32,000 residential roofs being changed over to be more reflective. And as I mentioned, it's the solar reflectance is going to increase shortly. And I say minimally because we know that there are 32,000. Building and Safety has kept those records, and that's what they say has been converted. And yet, what happens with the roofing manufacturers and the roofing distributors and the roofing companies, they don't want to have a shingle that's just right for Los Angeles, but doesn't quite work for a neighboring city like San Fernando. They're just going to get the most aggressive solar reflectance standard that's out there and make it the standard for the region. So according to our friends at Owens Corning and some of the other roofing manufacturers, when you have this one large city that enacts these cool roof policies, you get the bystander effect of all the other cities going along, not so much that they even have to put it into code, but it's the only kind of roofing shingle that's going to be available in the warehouses. It's going to be the ones that are more reflective, which is maybe a policy that you may want to pursue in the Sacramento region. If you get one city, you kind of get them all. Next slide, please. So Haley Gilbert at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, when she was there, convinced us to start looking into cool streets. And then we started looking at where we could do some experiments in the city of LA. We talked to the Bureau of Street Services, and what we discovered is that they were very interested because, again, when you work on this, you have actually something that you can do. So in the city, there's around 30 blocks that are now cool streets. Mostly this product called Cool Seal by the company Guard Top. It's a California-based company. There's another manufacturer called PMC that produces this material. Our organization has also worked to create a cool neighborhood in Canoga Park, working with Alta Engineering. We're really excited about this project to see if we can bring these benefits to a very decidedly low-income community. Anyway, here at our offices at the La Cretz Innovation Campus, we have 4 products being tested, and now out in a unincorporated part of LA County, the LA County is not to be outdone by the city. Now has 40 blocks of this Central Valley-based company called Asphalt Coatings Engineering. And the word on the street is that that material is less expensive and performing better than any of the materials we've tested here at LA City. And so I just wanted to share with you that there are a lot of projects going on. Next slide. So I just wanted to talk about opportunity. The Governor Newsom in his January budget announced that there was a big effort on urban cooling and looking at $200 million for urban greening, $125 million for cool surface materials, $25 million for community resilience planning, and $225 million for community resilience centers. I only hope that number goes up, but I thought I would bring it to your attention that the iron is about to be hot and the time to strike is soon. Next. And that's it. Thanks so much. I'm sorry I took so long.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. And now we have Kerry Whitlock from the City of Elk Grove.
Thank you, Grace. I'm going to try and go through this kind of quickly because I know we want to have some time for questions. So we are doing a, there we go. Okay. So the city got funded through a Caltrans adaptation planning grant last summer to do a community mobility resilience plan. We're working on it currently with a contract through Ascent Environmental, and it's expected to be completed by the end of this year. The focus is really on better preparing the city for the future and ensuring we're ready for how climate change is likely to impact us. And then the outcome will be an actual plan that details actions, funding strategies, partnerships that will help us to respond and adapt to those local impacts of climate change in terms of the transportation system and some associated community assets. So specifically, the plan is looking at 3 impact areas. We're looking at precipitation and flooding, extreme heat, and then fiscal impacts that are related to changes in the mobility landscape and how that's going to impact city revenue. And so I'm going to focus most of the discussion on heat because that's where we are, but I'll quickly go through some of the other impact areas. We have a working group established around these three areas, 3 different working groups around the areas, and we have a lot of engagement from a number of different CRC member organizations with SMUD, PG&E, our air district, the California Department of Water Resources and Regional Sanitation, and the Sacramento Tree Foundation. We have community members who are engaged in our working groups and various local organizations to the city. So we're really trying to broadly have these working groups help us advise and guide the development of some technical white papers in each of these areas that detail methodology, the analysis of the risks, identifying potential adaptation strategies for each of the areas, and then putting all that together with public comment about, you know, with these strategies, what makes sense within our particular context? What is the community most interested in and sort of comfortable with in terms of strategies to address this? And so all of this will feed into a full plan that, as I said, is hopefully going to be done by the end of this calendar year, with real expectation of implementation, and we'll have a long-term task force that'll help us with that implementation. So as I said, I'll do really quickly the other 2 and then focus on heat primarily. So flooding is expected to be similar to the rest of the Sacramento region in terms of the impacts. Specifically for Elk Grove, we expect that there will be larger swings in extremely dry and extremely wet multi-year periods. We're going to have we're going to have increases in small storm events and also in annual average precipitation. Both of those are likely to increase. And so we're looking at different strategies to address those. And I've just put some categories here. We grouped the strategies into different categories to help with communicating that to the public. We're looking at things that are a little bit more traditional strategies, you know, a resilient stormwater management system, you know, how do we adjust our design of those systems to manage larger storm events, to manage increased rainfall, and the transportation system, how do we deal with those sorts of things? But we're also trying to focus more on some newer approaches that have various co-benefits. So looking across things like flooding and heat, how do we come up with strategies that are, you know, more climate smart green infrastructure to capture runoff in a, you know, in a more natural, with more natural infrastructure that also then will help us reduce the urban heat island effect. So we're looking at a lot of different strategies to do these things and figuring out what might be different new approaches to addressing these impacts. The other area, as I said, is on fiscal, which is a little bit not so much climate related, though it is somewhat impacted by climate because, you know, we're looking at in California EV adoption, right? And we're looking at the amount of city revenue that comes from vehicle related areas. So a significant portion of our sales tax comes from fuel and auto sales, and 50% of our public works operation and maintenance budget comes from gas tax and Measure A sales tax. And so as we look at a greater autonomous vehicle adoption, greater electric vehicle adoption, what is that going to mean in terms of the city's revenue stream, and how can the city adapt to what those changes are going to look like? So with the fiscal, you know, we are looking at, we have an increasing population projected into 2050, and yet we are looking at trying to reduce our vehicle miles traveled. We're looking at how do we have, you know, more people adopting EVs, which last longer. You know, we still have the infrastructure that we need because the number of households are going to probably double in our city by 2050, and yet these vehicle-related sources of funding are expected to plateau very soon and could decline by 2050 as much as almost 70%. So how do we balance that, and what are some strategies? Some of these strategies are state level, right? There's been talk about a VMT tax, and that would need to be a state thing. But then what are some potential local strategies that we could also use in terms of replacing this? And Elk Grove is a little bit more of a suburban environment. So some of these congestion pricing, how would that work for us? And would that actually really do much? It might work a lot better in some place like Los Angeles than it would in our suburban area, but we're still looking at all of these to see what could it mean for us. So I was going to focus mostly on the extreme heat. And I think that, as both of the speakers have said, it's going to get hotter here, right? We're getting more days above 100 degrees. We're getting more heat waves. We're getting longer heat waves. So any particular heat wave event, rather than previously being 2 consecutive days above 103, we're likely to have 7 consecutive days above 103. And there may be 4 of those heat waves events in 1 year rather than just 1. So we're looking at how is that going to impact us as a city, and how can we deal with that. So some of the strategies, I put more detail here. We have the categories, and then I put some additional detail about what the specific strategies we're looking at, what that means. So we're of course looking at a lot of educational opportunities with our residents. How can we work with different partners, ensure that our residents understand about what the increased heat will do in terms of driving demand for electricity and for cooling? How do we work on reducing that demand? How do we work with SMUD, our local electricity provider, to figure out options for ensuring that resilient grid in our community, so that even as the heat goes up and demand goes up, we don't have breaks in the ability to provide that cooling for our residents. The resilient built environment is where we're trying to look at some different and newer technologies to try and adjust how we're going to do things. So this is where we look at the co-benefits. How are we figuring out things that could both deal with flooding and heat, greater green infrastructure to mitigate heat island, but also to capture rainwater? So looking at developing a roadmap for the high albedo material for the tree and the foliage and that sort of things that will help with making the city feel cooler, even if as it's getting hotter. So this is where we're trying to focus a lot of our efforts, is around these strategies, but we're still working on a number of different ones. We're looking at how do we make sure that we're doing social and economic resilience with our residents? How do we make sure we're promoting upgrades and behavior change to reduce that demand? Bolstering protections for those most vulnerable populations. So putting together strategies to deal with those, to address the heat impacts when we get to those heat events with that particular population. And then finally, we also have some of the more traditional strategies of looking at how is our roadway network, our transportation system, what do we need to do to make sure that those really are able to withstand? Do we need to look at different requirements related to either our transit system, related to our road infrastructure, our bridges, the train infrastructure, you know, any of those things. How do we look at those requirements differently, given that the heat is going to be increasing, and what does that mean for those? So I think we're almost at time. I'm going to leave it there, and I am happy to address questions if there's time, or do that virtually if there's not.
All right. Well, thank you to Hyder, Jonathan, and Kerry for participating in this webinar today. We do have a couple of questions. We'll try and get to those. Probably just have time for one question, and the rest that we'll get to in an email. Jonathan, this question is for you. If you could share any sample ordinances or initiatives for cool roofs and cool pavements that can be, could be model ordinances for other local governments.
Yes, we can. And it doesn't require very much to change the building code language. In fact, it's offered in this slide deck, but I'm happy to share that in a more editable form.
Great, thank you. And we do have time for one more question. And Jonathan, this is also for you, and then also Hyder, Kerry, if you have any anything else to add. What are some examples of projects or initiatives that smaller, less resource cities can implement to help mitigate the UHI?
I'm sorry. The question is, what are the smallest projects that a city?
For local governments that don't have a whole lot of money or staff capacity, what are some examples of initiatives that they could implement?
I guess from a technical perspective, I don't know, maybe Jonathan, Kerry have some other thoughts on this. I guess to me, it translates what is the most effective measure, if that's the question is. And again, different areas have different rankings for different measures. So in general, I mean, generally speaking, these measures of albedo change or vegetation cover increase are the most effective, but then there is a host of other measures, for example, cool walls or electrification or solar PV or ground-based vegetation cover. There's a whole range. And so my advice is to look at your particular region and see if we have addressed it in this study. There's a certain ranking of the most effective measures. But as far as implementation, maybe this is a question for Jonathan or Kerry. I don't know if you have any experience, what's the most inexpensive measure, or I don't know.
Yeah, it's Jonathan. If you upgrade to make a cool roof, you need to change your building code, but then you need permission from the California Energy Commission doing a cost-benefit analysis on having a higher solar reflectance roof than what is mandated in Title 24, Part 6. Part 6 relates to the actual energy efficiency, and that can be mandated, where Title 24, Part 11 is the Cal Green Code that is aspirational but not mandated. I'm trying to answer one of the questions from Naomi on the chat, so I hope that got to that. But to upgrade a building code, you do have to go through that process, and you do have to get permission from CEC. But the good news is that the utilities, the IOUs, have already created a template for every region in California on the cost-benefit analysis for cool roofs. And so where a cool roof may not be the right thing for Eureka, California, maybe not even for South Lake Tahoe, but for the rest of the state, there's a very good chance that the cost-benefit is there. And I think that's very inexpensive. And the materials at 0.25 are solar reflectance, are abundant, they're out there. There's a website that's called coolroofs.org that is run by the Cool Roof Rating Council. And you could go and check out literally thousands of products that where the solar reflectance has been tested. And these are products that are widely available on the market.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Dr. Taha, Jonathan, and Kerry for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who was able to participate in this webinar. We hope you found it worthwhile and valuable. And as a reminder, the webinar recording and PowerPoint presentations will be shared via email and also posted on CRC's website. We hope that you can join us for our final webinar in the series on Wednesday, February 26th. And if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you again for joining us today.